everyone, welcome to From the Kitchen Table. I'm Sean Duffy, along with my podcasting partner, my wife, some say, or I would say my life, Rachel Campos-Duffy.
Oh, that's so nice to hear. All right, so it's so great to be back at the kitchen table, and we've been worried, Sean, about what's been happening in Latin America. Not enough Americans are talking, and certainly not our media, are talking about what's happening in Latin America, particularly as it relates to China, who has made massive moves in Latin America, especially since the Biden administration has been in office. So I thought we'd bring in Ambassador Carlos Trujillo. He is the former ambassador of the OAS, which is the Organization of American States, which is essentially like the UN of Latin America. So let's, with no further ado, bring in Ambassador Trujillo. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sean and Rachel. It's an honor to be on your show.
So great to have you. So let's just get right into it. Talk to me about what China is doing in Latin America and what we as a country are doing in Latin America in terms of imparting our own national values.
And maybe, Carlos, before you answer that, just to be clear, you were the ambassador under President Trump. Since you guys have left from the Trump administration, we've seen a lot of changes in the Biden administration. Can you lay it out, what's been happening in Central and South America?
Sure. Under the Trump administration, our national security and our economic advancement were cornerstones of our foreign policy. And unfortunately, that's no longer the case. We've seen the last few months under the Trump administration, there was negative migration to the United States. More people were removed from the country than entered illegally, which was a historic accomplishment at that time. What we see now under the Biden administration is just a complete lack of respect for our own sovereignty. 200,000 plus illegal immigrants entering this country that we know of every single month, but also a lack of respect for the sovereignty of other countries. And I think that's really going back to the China question. That's where China is capitalizing. We don't respect our neighboring countries. We try to impose our social views. We try to impose our climate views. We try to impose this administration's priorities rather than respecting these countries and working to advance American interests, American security, and economic prosperity for the region. And China knows that and quickly takes advantage of providing cheap money, high debt loading these countries, taking over their assets with none of the social or climate strings attached. And unfortunately, it's worked. The hemisphere's preferred trading partner now is China in our own Western hemisphere.
You're saying right now it is
right now,
China.
If you look at preferred economic activity, the largest economy, and it's the only places we win are the CAF to DR countries, right? So the Mexico, Canada, Dominican Republic, and Central American countries, we beat China. Everywhere else, China whoops us. Brazil, Argentina, Chile. Brazil's sixth largest economy in the world. Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador. Everywhere else, China's beating us, especially with the larger economies, aside from Mexico, that really push the economic agenda in our hemisphere.
And Carlos, you would think that the American perspective with the Monroe Doctrine goes back, 100 years, that we have the philosophy that we want to control the Western Hemisphere. The United States does. We don't want to allow foreign entities to out-influence the United States. And it seems like the Biden administration has been more focused, to your point, on whether it's gay, transgender,
abortion rights.
That's right. All these social issues, as opposed to thinking through what are the strategic importance of an alliance between the U.S. and our hemisphere. They don't seem to care about that. They don't seem to care about American security. They care more about these social movements. Am I right?
Yeah, and this goes back actually to the Obama administration. Secretary Kerry, a real famous speech he gave in the Western Hemisphere was the Monroe Doctrine is dead. That is their view of the world. The view of the world is not American exceptionalism. It's not America's the greatest country on earth. It's not America will control not only our hemisphere, but we will control the international and economic prosperity and security of the world. Their view of it is America is just another country on the map, and we should be treated as such. So I think that view is long standing.
Yeah, it's so scary. And by the way, it's so much cultural imperialism on our part. I mean, these are mostly Catholic Christian countries, not many of them not interested in the radical abortion policies and much of the transgender, gay agenda, LGBTQ agenda that we're pushing on them. But again, let's go back to China. What are the implications for America if China is, as you say, the preferred trading partner And what are the implications for those countries? Because my understanding of China, just based on what they've done in Africa, is that they basically rape and pillage these countries, and they're not interested in the long-term good for these countries.
Yeah, so the implication for us is the destruction of democracy in our own hemisphere. When China takes over your cyber system, when China takes over through Huawei, when they take over your telecommunications, they could turn off the internet prior to an election. They could load the internet with bots prior to an election. They could dictate the outcome of every single democracy in our hemisphere, which is very, very scary to think. And their economic plan is to extract and export. They steal whatever natural resources, whether it's wildlife, whether it's rare earth minerals, gold, whatever they could steal, they steal it and export it back to mainland China. So that's what's at stake for our hemisphere. And ultimately, they're circling us. They're very aggressive in the Bahamas. You could go from Miami to the Bahamas in an hour and 15 minutes on a boat. The Chinese have a very, very strong presence in Nassau. They have a very strong presence in Bimini, the largest resort that's now run out of Bimini's, owned by the Chinese Communist Party. These are things that affect our national security, and all their objectives not always economic. It's really their ability to capture intelligence, to have valuable intelligence, and to use that intelligence to their advantage. And that's really what they've started doing across the entire hemisphere.
You know, Carlos, what concerns me is that the Biden administration, and to your point, goes back to the Obama administration. It seems like they want to partner with communist aligned or socialist aligned regimes, whether it's in Cuba or Venezuela. And I think that case in point is right now, as we've seen in the news, that Chevron has now been given permission by the Biden administration to partner in Venezuela to extract oil. But at the same time, Gaia, right, is on the south. Guyana, close. Yeah. Sorry, Carlos. I'm not a Western Hemisphere expert, but it's on the southeast corner of Venezuela, north of Brazil. And they found huge resources of oil, clean, low in sulfur, way cleaner than the Venezuelan oil. And the U.S., because of climate change, has said we're not going to partner with them. We're not going to allow investment there in Guyana, but we're going to allow it in Venezuela. This strategy makes absolutely no sense. One, if you care about clean energy, and two, if you care about the influence of China in the region, because if we don't partner in Guyana, the Chinese are going to come in and develop those resources.
What's even more concerning is that their agenda is built on climate change and human rights, but they are happy to do business with a country that has no sort of environmental safeguards. Venezuela, they literally pour mercury because of their illegal gold mining into the Amazon. And their human rights, they have torture chambers set up all over the country in which civilians who protest are beaten, tortured, and killed. And we're okay with doing business with communist totalitarian Venezuela, but we're concerned about clean energy, not only in Guyana, but in the United States of America. We're willing to shut down the Keystone Pipeline because we're concerned about human rights and climate activity in Canada, but we're not concerned about climate activity in Venezuela or their human rights records. The policy makes absolutely no sense. These are the same people who are going back to negotiate with Iran. We're concerned about human rights, like that's a pillar of their agenda. They're concerned about social rights, but they're willing to do business with Iran and Venezuela.
How do you explain it? I mean, it just makes no sense. And again, the way that the Biden administration has alienated the few U.S. allies, Guyana was one of them, by the way. But even, you know, in Central America with Guatemalan leader, I mean, anyone who is remotely pro-American, they seem to you know, shun. And then they embrace the worst of the worst in Latin America, who, by the way, are already aligned with China.
I think a lot of these things are ruse, right? They claim to be the champions of human rights, but countries who actually have strong human rights records, Dominican Republic, it's a strong human rights, strong democracy, massive economic growth. We treat them absolutely terribly. But we're okay with doing business with Venezuela. We're okay with Lula winning the presidency of Brazil, the most corrupt person in the history of the hemisphere, the person who was responsible for Odebrecht, an international corruption scandal. But their policy, I think, is much more driven by ideology than it is driven by outcome and advancing American interests and security.